Hello, in this video we are going to be looking at the religious language component from the unit Metaphysics of God. Now, in terms of this unit, religious language is basically looking at the status of religious statements in terms of their meaning. Statements such as God exists, the Lamb of God takes away the sins of the world, God loves you. So are these statements meaningful or meaningless? And the way that you go about trying to answer this question is rather similar to the metaethical component of the moral philosophy unit when you're asking questions about the meanings of moral claims. All right? So there is a nice synoptic link to be made there. In addition to this, obviously, we'll be looking at whether religious language is cognitive or non-cognitive. And again, there's quite a bit of crossover here between God and the metaethical part of the moral philosophy unit. So let's start with cognitivism and non-cognitivism. Any argument that tries to prove God exists through reason or based in observation is a cognitive argument. So, for example, the cosmological argument is cognitive, the teleological argument is cognitive, as is the ontological argument. Although for different reasons, because obviously in the case of the ontological argument, it's through reason alone that you're trying to prove God's existence, whereas with the cosmological and teleological arguments, you are to some extent basing your beliefs on evidence. Okay, so any of those arguments is trying to prove that God exists, that the statement God exists is true. Right? And that's what makes it cognitive. However, there are some who believe that religious language is non-cognitive in the sense that it describes an attitude or an emotional response to the world rather than something that is either factually true or not. All right? And there are several ideas that you can bring in here. You might, for example, argue that since God is all-powerful and since faith is a central aspect of religion, that the very idea of God exists being a cognitive statement is actually a bit of nonsense, because God being all-powerful will never allow you to prove that true or false. But we'll come back to that point in a while. Okay, the main point here is just to make the distinction between cognitivism and non-cognitivism. So cognitive statements describe how the world is. So if I say water boils at 100 degrees, that's a cognitive statement, it's a fact. A triangle has three sides is also a fact, although the way that you establish that water boils at 100 degrees is different from the way that you establish whether or not a triangle has three sides. Water boils at 100 degrees can be proved true or false through observation. A triangle has three sides is known analytically, right? Because has three sides is actually internal to the definition of a triangle. St. Paul's Cathedral is in London. That is an example of a cognitive statement based on observation, empirically. And the Eiffel Tower is in Berlin is obviously false because we know through observation that it's actually in Paris. So contrast cognitivism with non-cognitivism, and non-cognitive statements do not describe how the world is. They don't tell us any facts. Okay, so they're in some sense just emotional responses. And here again, you can make a nice little link between non-cognitive religious statements, if you like, if that's what you believe, if you believe they're all non-cognitive, and A.J. Ayer's claim that moral statements are non-cognitive. So if you think about the theory of emotivism in metaethics, for example, emotivism is sometimes known as the boo-hurrah theory, all right, because it essentially says that moral statements are expressions of deeply held beliefs or attitudes. Giving to charity, hurrah, murder, boo. Okay, so if boo, as in, thumbs down, that's a non-cognitive exclamation because it doesn't actually tell us anything factual about the world. Similarly, hurrah is an expression of optimism and happiness, and again, it doesn't tell you anything about the world. It's just an expression. Right? As are moral imperatives in this sense, so do X or do not do X, okay? They're not telling you anything about the world, they're just telling you how to act. All right, so that is non-cognitivism, and so this distinction between cognitivism and non-cognitivism is the same when we're talking about religious language as it is when we're talking about moral language. That the idea is to answer the same question. You know, are religious statements meaningful? Do they tell us something about how the world or the universe is, or are they just expressions of deeply held belief and attitude? In exactly the same way as in metaethics, the question is, are moral claims telling us something about the world in terms of facts? In which case, if they are, you'd be a moral realist. Or are they just expressions of attitudes and deeply held beliefs? In which case, you would be a moral irrealist and a non-cognitivist. Okay, so there's a nice synoptic link between the two. So, as I said, cognitivism is the view of religious language which treats it as making claims that are true or false. When someone says, God answers my prayers, then, according to the cognitivist, they are making a statement that they take to be true. So there would have to be a way of establishing that this is actually true. And this is an interesting one, because if you think about what we normally count as an answer, then there has to be a definite response to a question, right, that falls within certain parameters. All right. So if I have a wish and I say to my wife that I wish that I could have a new pair of shoes for my birthday, if I get that new pair of shoes, then she has answered my wishes. All right. And if I don't get those pair of shoes, then she hasn't. But in relation to God answers prayers, some Christians, perhaps those that you might argue take a non-cognitivist position, might say that we can't tell in that kind of framework whether God has answered prayers or not, because what we count as an answer might not be what God counts as an answer. We don't know how God moves. God moves in mysterious ways, so we can't know if God has answered our prayers. And of course, then it becomes a question of whether this idea of God answers prayers is meaningful or meaningless, because if it's meaningful, there must be a way of establishing it, but if you can't establish it, then it's meaningless. All right? So that's another way of exploring this question, all right, in particular in relation to that statement. So non-cognitivism, as I said, are neither true nor false. And if, for example, I was to say this beautiful view is God's creation, I may not be, if I'm a non-cognitivist, I may not be saying, or I wouldn't be saying, that this beautiful view is literally something that God created in the same way that I might, make a chest of drawers out of wood or something like that. Right? This chest of drawers is the creation of Adrian. That would be a cognitive statement. But in this kind of sense, what we're doing is we're expressing something other than that. We're expressing a sense of wonder and a sense of perhaps even love of this beautiful view. And that would be a non-cognitive. It would be a non-cognitive statement in that sense, because it would just express my attitude towards the world. All right. So if we think about logical positivism for a minute, they, as you'll know if you've studied metaethics, they relied on the verification principle. Now, the verification principle was developed by a group of philosophers known as the Vienna Circle, headed up by a professor of philosophy at Vienna University called Moritz Schlick. But for whatever reason, A.J. Ayer seems to get much more of the credit in the AQA specification. So just for safety of exam answers, as it were, talk about A.J. Ayer rather than Moritz Schlick. Now, the verification principle runs more or less like this. A statement only has meaning if it can be verified or falsified, either through analysis or observation. So, an analytic truth, for example, can be verified or falsified through analysis. Okay, a triangle has three sides. We only have to reflect on the concept of a triangle to realize that it has three sides, so that is analytically true. If I said a triangle has four sides, we would know that that was an internal contradiction, because has four sides contradicts the idea of a triangle. Okay, so you can know truth and falsity in that sense through analysis. And then you've also got observation. So something is empirically verifiable. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. The average global atmospheric pressure is 1013.3 millibars, and so on. Okay, these are things that can be verified through observation, and provided a statement falls into one of these two categories, according to the logical positivists, it is meaningful. All right. If, on the other hand, it doesn't, so for example, if we say God answers prayers and we are not suggesting a conventional idea of what it means to answer something, in other words, I might pray, for example, for a sick relative to be healed and that sick relative dies, that would, under normal circumstances, count as not having your prayers answered. But often to religious folk, they will suggest that, well, you know, we don't know God's will, and so it's not possible for us to say whether God has answered prayers under normal criteria. Rather, I can still accept that God has answered prayers because God knows better than me, and God will have answered the prayers in the way that he sees fit, not in the way that I do. Right? Now, a logical positivist would say, well, look, basically, the statement God answers prayers is then a form of nonsense because there's no way of verifying it as true or false. And similarly, if there's no way of verifying the idea that God exists as true or false, then again, we can say, according to the logical positivists, that that statement is nonsense. However, there is the well-known reply to logical positivism, which is that the verification principle itself cannot be verified or falsified either through analysis or through observation. Right? So if you look at it here, a statement is only meaningful if it is analytic or empirically verifiable. Is itself neither an analytic truth nor empirically verifiable, so it's hoist with its own petard, so to speak. All right? It's undermined by its own criteria. All right? So according to its own criteria, the verification principle is meaningless. Let's now turn to look at falsifiability. Now, falsifiability is slightly different from verification, but nevertheless, falsifiability argues that unless a statement can in principle be falsified, it is meaningless. All right? So it's an explanation of what it takes for a theory to be meaningful, not whether it is true or false. That's the fundamental distinction between falsifiability and the verification principle. All right? So unfalsifiable theories are meaningless because they're not capable of being true or false. If I make a theory about something, then I'm creating a hypothesis which ought to be able to be tested. All right? If it's tested, it could be found to be true or it could be false. So in principle, it could be false. But if you could never falsify that theory or that hypothesis, then actually what you've got is not really a hypothesis at all, but a form of nonsense. Okay? And so this is a classic statement of an unfalsifiable theory. Everything in the universe doubles in size every 10 seconds. Well, that's obviously unfalsifiable because there's no observation that could disprove it. All right? So if I tried measuring stuff to see if it doubled in size every 10 seconds, well, that wouldn't be any good because my ruler, or whatever I was measuring it with, would also be doubling in size every 10 seconds and be relative to everything else. Okay? So it couldn't be proven wrong. Okay? So that makes it just a form of nonsense. And Antony Flew developed his parable of the invisible gardener in order to try to demonstrate this in relation to how people think about God. All right? He says that God exists is unfalsifiable, and therefore you cannot make sense of it as an idea. And he creates this analogy, as I say, the parable of the invisible gardener. And it runs more or less as follows. You've got two explorers and they find a clearing in a jungle. Explorer A says the clearing is obviously the work of a gardener, and Explorer B, who is the atheist, disagrees. All right? So to settle the argument, they set up various tests. Okay, they put up traps, guard dogs, and so on. And they can't see the gardener and so on. And as time goes on, they might try even more tests. And again, nothing happens. All right, and eventually Explorer A says, look, the gardener is invisible, he's intangible, he makes no sound, he has no smell. All right, there's literally the gardener could be immaterial, right? And then Explorer B says, well, hang on a minute, what is the difference between that and the claim that the gardener doesn't actually exist? Okay, and the answer is, of course, that there isn't much difference, or there's no difference at all, and that shows Explorer A's theory to be unfalsifiable. All right, nothing could ever prove Explorer A's theory of the invisible gardener wrong, but then nothing can prove it correct either, and therefore, because it's unfalsifiable, the theory is meaningless. Okay, so the analogy is supposed to take Explorer A is the theist, and Explorer B is the atheist. All right, and so it seems more reasonable to suggest that Explorer B is right, because there doesn't seem to be any way in which you can falsify Explorer A's theory. Okay, so just as an aside, interestingly, a few years before his death, Antony Flew actually converted to deism. All right, I'm not quite sure of the reason why. Actually, that's something I ought to look up. But he did. He'd been an atheist all his life and a champion of atheism. And as I say, a few years before his death, he converted to deism. Anyhow, yeah, that's Flew's analogy, and then he just says, well, look, this is what people who believe in God often say. You know, look, we can't measure God's existence, we can't test for God in that way, because God is intangible. God is not a part of the universe in the same way that the rest of us are. All right, and they could go on by saying, well, look, it's a matter of faith that God exists, and God being all-powerful would make it the case that we can't actually prove or disprove his existence anyway, right? And so you could add that idea into Explorer A's armory, and Explorer B would just say, well, look, there's nothing that you can falsify in any of this, and so your theory that God exists is nonsense. So, in short, Flew is arguing that God exists is meaningless because such a claim is unfalsifiable in the same way that the existence of the invisible gardener is unfalsifiable. Now, there is a response to this made by Basil Mitchell and his parable of the resistance fighter, or the partisan fighter. All right. Now, Mitchell agrees with Flew that in order for a statement to be meaningful, it must be possible to prove it wrong, right? You must be able to definitely falsify it if it's to be meaningful. But just because there are some observations that count against a point of view does not mean that you have to abandon it altogether. Right? He gives this example. Right? You're in a war and your country has been occupied by an enemy, and you meet someone who claims to be the leader of the French, or say the French resistance, but claims to be the leader of the resistance, and you trust this person. However, sometimes they act in ambiguous ways. You know, are they a double agent? Are they just acting so as not to get in trouble by the enemy, and so on? You just don't really know what's going on. Nevertheless, you continue to believe in that person because you trust them. All right? And this can be applied to the notion of faith, that you continue to believe in God because you trust God. Yes, it's the case that you can't falsify many of your claims about God, such as God answers prayers or God exists, all right? But you trust in that idea, all right? So despite some contrary evidence, for example, the existence of evil in the world, you might think to yourself, nevertheless, all right, I still believe in God because I have reasons to trust, all right? So just because there is some evidence against God doesn't mean you have to withdraw that belief altogether. But nevertheless, Basil Mitchell is still essentially a cognitivist, right? He's still essentially saying that, in order to make meaningful claims about God, there does have to be a way, in the end, of falsifying such claims. And if there isn't, then any of these claims are meaningless. Right, now, this is where it gets interesting, okay? Because there's this three-way debate going on between Antony Flew, Basil Mitchell, and Richard Hare. All right? And according to Richard Hare, religious statements are not things that can just be shown to be true or false in the same way that science tries to show things to be true or false. All right, but he also doesn't deny that some religious folk do think of such statements in this way, and it is true. You know, some people think that God exists or God answers prayers can be verified or falsified, but there are plenty, of course, who don't think in that way, and these are the folk that Hare is really talking about. Okay, so religious language, he believes, expresses faith in the sense that it expresses an attitude, right? And this attitude Hare calls a blick, right? That's just Hare's term for it. Okay, so a blick is a way of seeing the world. All right. So if you think back to what I was saying earlier about looking out and seeing God's creation, right? That expression may just be a way, Hare argues, of my expressing how I see the world, right? Someone else might just go, well, it's a nice view, and all of this is the product of evolution and geological processes or whatever, all right? And that would be an expression of how they see the world, all right? So in that sense, seeing the world as God's creation or understanding God as answering prayers could just be a kind of attitude I have towards the world. It's a way of seeing the world, right? And here are some other examples. The first one is adapted from Hare's own example. So a paranoid person who thinks university lecturers are trying to kill him, right? Even if you assure that person they're not trying to kill him and provide evidence, they'll believe it anyway, because how they see the situation will mean that different things count as evidence for them than they do for you, all right? So you might know that these university lecturers are really kind, benign people who really care for their students. But the paranoid person might look at them and go, well, this is all part of a ruse. This is evidence of the fact that they are deceitful, of the fact that, you know, they're trying to pull the wool over my eyes in order that they then can strike without me actually realizing, they're trying to lull me into a false sense of security and all of that. Okay. Similarly, somebody who suffers from body dysmorphia, for example, who thinks that they're ugly, even though lots of people say that they're not ugly, all right, they express a form of attitude towards how they look, and their attitude means that they actually count different things as evidence for their beliefs. So they won't use the same evidence as somebody who says that they're not ugly, in the same way that the paranoid person won't use the same evidence to justify his belief that his university lecturers are trying to kill him. All right. So disagreements in blicks can't be settled by appealing to evidence, and so they're technically unfalsifiable, right? And they can't be settled by appealing to evidence because the worldview, the attitude, or the blick, if you like, actually determines what counts as evidence in the first place. So Hare, as I say, Hare thinks that blicks are meaningful as a part of someone's worldview, and they determine what does and does not count as evidence. Now, as I say, one more example here. This is my example. Imagine an old lady, right? And she has been happily married for 60 years, and then tragically one day her husband dies, and she's left on her own, and most of her friends have either moved away or died as well. And throughout their marriage, it had apparently been a happy one. They'd gone out a lot, they'd laughed, they'd supported each other, and so on. And had you asked the lady during their marriage, how do you know your husband loves you? She would have said, well, of course he loves me. Look what we do. You know, we're always having a laugh, we go out a lot, we support each other, and so on. But now she's alone in her house, in silence, with nothing but the radio for company. And she begins to reflect on her marriage. And she thinks that, yes, there were some times when maybe he ignored me. Sometimes he was just reading the paper and didn't talk to me. Maybe actually he didn't love me after all, but because, you know, he believed that he'd married me and therefore he had to stick by me, right? That was just why he was just trying to get along with me. And she then begins to think perhaps that the marriage was a sham, that he didn't really love her as he claimed, and so on. And so what you can see here is that the old lady's attitude has changed, and she started to count different things as evidence to support her view. So now she's appealing to those times when perhaps he didn't talk to her or he was reading the newspaper. And instead of thinking, oh, he just wanted a bit of alone time to sort of catch up with the news, she's now thinking that this is something significant in terms of how he thought about her. All right? And the thing is that it's the attitude that's determining what counts as evidence. Right? And this is what Hare's trying to get across. Okay. So if we go back to Hare's paranoid student, because obviously that's the example that Hare actually uses himself, hopefully you understand how this works now. So this is actually a quote from Hare. A certain lunatic is convinced that all dons, that is academics, want to murder him. His friends introduce him to all the mildest and most respectable dons that they can find. And after each of them has retired, they say, you see, he doesn't really want to murder you. He spoke to you in a most cordial manner. Surely you are convinced now. But the lunatic replies, yes, but that was only his diabolical cunning. He's really plotting against me the whole time, like the rest of them. I know it, I tell you. How many kindly dons are produced? The reaction, however many kindly dons are produced, the reaction is still the same. All right. So we can see that the student's attitude is determining what he counts as evidence. I just want to take a look at John Hick's eschatological verification now. This will involve us returning to themes relating to the verification principle and logical positivism. And John Hick, a well-known theist, argued that eschatological verification suggests that a statement can be verified after death, and because it can be verified after death, or in principle verified after death, it is not therefore meaningless. Right? So there is an afterlife is not meaningless because in principle it can be verified or falsified after death. And Hick argues that many religious claims are about things beyond the limits of human life. So these claims are not unfalsifiable because it's possible to verify them after we die. And because in principle that can be the case, according to Hick anyway, these statements are actually still meaningful. So for example, the statement there is an afterlife is unfalsifiable while we are living, but because it might or could be true, this means that it's not actually unverifiable, which means therefore that it is still meaningful, right? So he's trying to sort of make an argument against the logical positivist idea that because such a statement can't be proved true or false either by analysis or through observation on this earth, that doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be verified or falsified at all, and therefore it is still meaningful. Okay? So if there is an afterlife, then such a statement is not meaningless. But I hope you can see the problem. If there is no afterlife, you won't exist to verify it one way or the other, so it is unfalsifiable and therefore meaningless. Okay? I won't say too much more about eschatological verification. It is something perhaps that you could just put in passing if you're talking about logical positivism. So that's the end of this video.